And I'm dealing here with how the Gospels work. And in particular, I'm going to look at particular places in the Gospels that skeptics use to say you can't trust the Gospels, or you can't work with the Gospels, and show how those kinds of passages work. So I'm going to do some stuff that's going to be general and generic, and I'm going to do other stuff that is very passage specific to show the range of things that happen in the Gospels. And my theme for the time that we're together is let the Gospels breathe. That sometimes we have a preconception about how the Gospels work, but the way to know how the Gospels work is to actually look at the Gospels themselves and see how they are working. And so I'm going to try and point that out as we go. I may point out some stuff that you may or may not have heard or thought about before, and we have the question time afterwards to help you, even if I say something that initially might seem to disturb you, but I'm hoping not to disturb you by the end. But we have a counselor here to deal with it when we're all done. So we're in good shape in terms of that situation. So, one Jesus, four Gospels. How do the Gospels work? Let me start with a generic category first. Let me start first with how the Gospels in general work. Three of the Gospels are known as the Synoptics. If you know anything about Greek, you'll know that the synoptic is two Greek words put together. The term optic, which means to see, and the term soon, which means together. So these are Gospels that can be seen together because so much of their content overlaps. There's a lot of overlap between Mark and Matthew. There's a lot of overlap between Mark and Luke. In fact, most scholars will say that about 96% of Mark can be found either in Matthew or in Luke. So the synoptics tend to be viewed together. And then there's John sitting there out there all by himself, because about 88% of John is unique to his gospel. Now, I'm going to make an observation here, and the observation I'm going to make is the church really likes the Gospel of John. And the reason the church really likes the Gospel of John is because the Gospel of John does all our heavy Christian lifting for us in terms of presenting Jesus. Jesus presented in many ways, most fully and most directly in the Gospel of John. But I'm going to argue that understanding how the synoptics work and the way in which the synoptics work is important to the church. And other than just telling stories about Jesus' life, there's something that the synoptic gospels are doing that we need to appreciate when we teach or preach in the synoptic gospels that's worth thinking about. So to start off with this idea, I want to tell you a little story that happened to me. I once was asked to teach a class in New Testament Introduction, not a whole semester, but just one class, on the Gospel of Luke at the University of Michigan, which is your typical university. It's not a Christian school by any means, etc. And I was invited there by a professor who comes from a very different theological persuasion than I was, but we had worked together, and so he knew I was going to be in the mission area. He says, "Why don't you teach my class on the Gospel of Luke, and then I'll arrange for you to teach another class." The second class was a Ph.D. seminar that was led by a Jewish professor. And he must have known where I was from and that I was not only a believer, but came from a conservative seminary, because he opened the seminar this way. He said to the students, as we were going to talk about issues tied to Jesus and historical Jesus, we don't have anything that Jesus himself actually wrote. There's no Gospel of Jesus, which, if you think about that for a second, that's a true point. Okay? We don't have anything himself that Jesus himself wrote. So all the Gospels that we have are coming from someone else. So he was trying to suggest he couldn't be too confident about what we knew about Jesus. And so that was the way I was introduced. So that was exciting. And so there happened to be 12 students in the class. God has a sense of humor. And so there were 12 students in the class. So I said to the professor, how long are these students with you? How long are they taking classes before they write their dissertation? 3 years. And I said, do you think in the 3 years that they are with you taking your classes that they are able to articulate what your major emphases are in teaching what you teach. And the response I got was silence. Okay? In other words, he knew what I was doing, and he knew what the answer was, and he wasn't saying. So, and I make that point to say that what we have in the Gospels is the impact that Jesus had on various people, as opposed to hearing from the teacher directly himself in something that he's written, in which he's revealing what's going on in his mind. Okay? I mean, we know the expressions that he has and what he's in his mind, at least to a degree, from the kinds of things that are revealed. But they're revealed to us through the eyes of various people who are impacted by his presence. And that set of testimony is a complementary set of testimonies, where each person is contributing a particular understanding with particular sets of concerns that they have as they present how Jesus has impacted them, or as they've gathered the materials in the church that show how Jesus has impacted the community. And so that's important to understand. And the Gospels, therefore, are made up of multiple complementary angles. And the best way I know how to describe this is to appeal to a sports metaphor. And since I'm in Europe, I will appeal to the game of what we call soccer, what you all rightly call football. And I'm going to appeal to the VAR, okay, the video review. And you're asking the question, did a foul occur? Did it occur inside or outside the box? Did a goal occur? Did the ball go totally across the goal line or not? Those kinds of questions. And of course, there are multiple camera angles. And some camera angles answer that question, and other camera angles don't answer that question. And so that's like the way the Gospels work. They are asking certain questions depending on the concerns of given authors. They may or may not overlap, but that means that in the overlap, they are not overlapping in this way. The difference automatically means contradiction. And many times when you're dealing with skeptics, the way they will handle a difference is they will automatically say, not only is it a difference, it's a contradiction. One writer is automatically correcting another. That is actually not necessarily the case. In fact, I would argue that most times it's not the case. It may be that one author has a set of concerns or issues that they want to raise that the other author isn't interested in, thus generating a set of details that the other writer doesn't have. That's the first point that I want to make. There are multiple complementary angles. I want to make a second point, and this is the more profound of the 2 points I think I want to make. It is that the Synoptic Gospels tell the story of Jesus from the earth, basically from the earth up. You watch it dawn on people who Jesus is. And the amount of disclosure that you're getting about who Jesus is often very subtle. And I'll talk about how that works in just a second. Whereas John tells the story of Jesus from heaven down. The first verse of John is, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. This is CNN. Okay? That's how the gospel opens. You know from the very first verse where John is taking you. And he is direct and explicit. That's why the church likes the Gospel of John, because it does all our heavy lifting for us. But the experience of coming to Jesus is more like the Synoptics than the way John presents Jesus. Because everyone who comes to Jesus has to learn who he is. It has to dawn on them who he is, because Jesus, think about this, is actually a quite unusual human being. Out of all the human beings who have ever walked the earth, and there have been a lot of us, how many of them have claimed to be the Creator God incarnate? How big a category is that? Like one. He's the only one. So if you're talking to someone who doesn't come from a religious background and who doesn't understand, doesn't have a theological bone in their body, and you say Jesus is the Son of God, He's the incarnate God in flesh, you are creating a category for them that they probably don't have. And in fact, I sometimes say that when we engage in evangelism today around people who don't have a Christian background, you're oftentimes in the business of creating categories they don't have, and they have to have those categories to understand what you're saying to them. So it's an important point. And so my suggestion is that the Synoptics tell the story as it happens to people. No one comes to Jesus this way. They're born, they get the swat of life, and they go, wah, wah, wah. Jesus is the second person of the ontological Trinity. Wah, wah, wah. Okay, no one comes to Jesus that way. Everyone who comes to Jesus because someone sat down, or someone sat down, or somehow they heard about this very unusual human being who's walked the earth, who's in the middle of what God is doing in one way or another. And so you watch in the Synoptic Gospels how it dawns on people who Jesus is. He calms the winds and the waves. And what question comes at the end of that passage? Who is this who's able to command the winds and the waves and they obey Him? Or you watch Jesus claim to forgive sins, and the theologians in the audience say, well, only God can forgive sins. And then Jesus explains how He, as the Son of Man, has the authority to forgive sins. He's a human being who's doing God stuff, that kind of thing. And so, and you watch it dawn on people, either accept or reject what that claim represents. And that story unfolds. It starts basically with categories that we understand. In Matthew and in Luke, we've got a baby. Baby may be in a manger, the baby's been born. In Mark, we don't even tell anything about the younger life of Jesus. We start right with John the Baptist. And then we watch it dawn on people as the story unfolds, how it's told. Now, when we tell it in the church, we tend to undercut the way in which the Synoptic Gospels actually work, because we're so interested in getting to the bottom line of who Jesus ultimately is that we leap from the story and where it is in the story and where it is in the development that to Jesus as the Son of God, He died for your sins, etc. But if you're in a Bible study situation or something like that, it might actually be useful to read the Synoptic Gospels the way they were designed in part, which is to have people focus on how is it that Jewish people who are monotheists came to understand that Jesus was who He claimed to be as the Son of God. And to let that unfold as the story moves along. So my point is, one of the ways that the gospel works is we have 3 gospels that tell the story of Jesus from the earth up. We have one gospel that tells it from heaven down. Well, I call John the upon further review gospel. I'm using a phrase out of American sports. And the point is, John is reflecting kind of what's really going on with Jesus in the most direct kind of way. And he's kind of in your face with all the theology that's represented, whereas the Synoptic Gospels have chosen to be more subtle about how they go about it. Here's another way the Gospels work, although I'm going to use an example out of Acts to illustrate it. And that is that there's a consistency in the stories that overlap, but they also are told with some variation, but the gist of the story in the various versions is the same. So you get similarity and difference mixed together in the way in which the stories are told when they overlap. At least a lot of times they do. And so my example comes from Acts 9, Acts 22, and Acts 26, and I'll see how awake you are. What event in Acts are we talking about from those 3 passages? The conversion of Paul. Okay, Jesus appearing to Paul on the Damascus Road. It's told 3 separate times in Acts, and also is told to us by the same author. This is important because it shows how people retell stories in the ancient world, or at least how they can retell them. And what's interesting about the example from Acts 9, Acts 22, and Acts 26 is that in the first version, Ananias is a very important player in the story. He's the one to whom Paul goes after he's been blinded by this vision, And he shows up, and Ananias is the one who announces to Paul what his calling is. The story gets retold 2 more times. By the time we get to Acts 26, Ananias is missing in action. He's not there. Nothing is said about him, etc. So here are 3 different stories, the core piece of which, that is the gist, is that Paul went from being a persecutor to being a follower of Jesus as a result of an appearance that Jesus made to him on the Damascus Road. But some of the other details between the stories are slightly different in the retelling. Now, some people will say, well, some of that retelling is because they're part of one piece. That could be. But my point is, all 3 versions of that retelling tell us about the event. They just don't tell us all the same things about that event. And that's also the way events work between the Gospels. You get a retelling, but you don't get all the same details, but everything that you get is there and is supposed to be taken seriously. So that's a second thing the Gospels themselves also do in the retelling of the story. Now, just to make the point clear and then to add something on top of it, it is that when this happens, sometimes there are important things going on. I tell people that when you read the Synoptic Gospels in particular, but this is true of all the Gospels, that the Gospels work off of cultural scripts. The last point I'm going to make, and I'll make it initially now, is that in many parts of the Gospels, it's not what Jesus says about himself that's important, it's what Jesus does. That the actions of Jesus sometimes reveal as much Christology about who Jesus is as the things Jesus says about himself. So most people, when they read the Gospels, say, well, what kind of titles did Jesus use about himself? How did he describe himself? Did he use the term Messiah? Did he use the term Son of God? Did he use the term Christ? That kind of thing. And they think you can get at who Jesus is by asking that question, and that certainly is one way to do it. But a lot of the heavy lifting in the Gospels, because we're asking how the Gospels work, come not from that, but by the kinds of things that Jesus does. And they're usually revolved around things that I describe as cultural scripts. So let me illustrate for you a cultural script, and I'll see if this will work, because I'm in Europe. And so here we go. Bayern is going to Barcelona to win the cup. What am I talking about? Football. Now, football's nowhere in that sentence. So how do you know that? You live in a culture in which the combination of Barcelona, Bayern, and cup point to football. Okay? Let me give you another sentence. This is a little harder. This will be harder for some of you. Ian Botham marched to the crease to defend the Ashes on behalf of the Queen. That's cricket. Yeah, those of you who are British are all smiling. I do that for students in America, all right, and they're looking at me cross-eyed. They have no idea what I'm talking about. Again, cricket is nowhere in that sentence. And you know that because you share the culture, and the culture is shorthand for a lot of things that are going on. Okay? You know it's cricket. You may know that Ian Botham at one point was the captain of the English national team. If you understand the Ashes, you know exactly what we're talking about. Because the Ashes is the name of the trophy that Australia and England play for whenever they're in a test match. And the Ashes series that happens on a regular basis. Okay, so you might be surprised that an American even knows that. But anyway, so that's the example. Now let me give you one more that comes from the United States. The Cowboys are going to the frozen tundra to melt the cheeseheads. Okay? That's a perfectly beautiful American English sentence. Okay? All right? And what am I talking about? American football. Oh, grief. The Romanians know what I'm talking about here. Okay. Now, I want you to see how much is wrapped up in a cultural script. Because a cultural script is shorthand It's how to say something in a short space, packed, in which you're actually being given a lot of information that is implicit, not explicit. But if you share the culture, you know what's being said. So, the Cowboys are the Dallas Cowboys. The Cheeseheads are the Green Bay Packers. The frozen tundra is Lambeau Field in Green Bay, Wisconsin. And you know the game is being played in winter because you call it the frozen tundra because the game is being played in very cold conditions in the northern United States. All that is wrapped up in that one sentence, and the word football isn't there anywhere. Here's the fun part of this. If I sent that sentence to Saudi Arabia and gave someone learning English an Arabic English dictionary, and they didn't share the culture, they could look up every word, and after they looked up every word, they still would have no clue what that sentence is saying. So cultural scripts work because the writer and the person receiving the information share the cultural context of what is being uttered and thus understand what's involved in what's being said. Now, why did I go through that long illustration? I went through that long illustration to introduce this issue, which often comes up in discussion of the Gospels. In how many of your countries is there a thing called the Red Letter Bible? Just to show, you have Red Letter Bibles in Romania? And they've got it in Slovakia and where else? Okay, all right, the Red Letter Bible. What is the Red Letter Bible supposed to suggest? These are the words of Jesus, okay? We're hearing the real Jesus here, all right? So the question is this. Are we hearing the very words of Jesus or are we hearing the very voice of Jesus? Or if we're hearing the very words of Jesus or we're getting Jesus' meaning, how are we getting Jesus' meaning? So I'm going to illustrate this through a biblical text. I'm not trying to create a problem. I'm trying to reflect the reality of the Scriptures. And I said at the beginning, you need to let the Scriptures breathe. You need to let the Scriptures be what they are. You need to let the Gospels be what they are. So let's talk about Peter at Caesarea Philippi, in which Jesus asked this question, which comes to us in two forms, depending on which Gospel we're reading. Who do people say the Son of Man is? Who do people say I am? Okay? So you read in one Gospel, you get who do people say the Son of Man is? And then you get who do people say that I am? And then Jesus, the disciples answer. And they usually say one of the prophets, and they go through a list, that kind of thing. And then Jesus follows it up with this question. And in one version is, and who do you say the Son of Man is? And who do you say that I am? Okay? Not the same, but different. So much so that some liberal scholars will say about the Son of Man, when Jesus talks about the Son of Man, he's talking about somebody else. But there's a cultural script that's operating at two levels when that's going on. The first one I'm going to illustrate with the British Prime Minister. And that Prime Minister is Margaret Thatcher. All right? When Margaret Thatcher was Prime Minister of England, all right, and she, introduced policies. This is while I was a doctoral student at Aberdeen. And she was introducing policies that were, how can I say, putting strain on Britain. Okay, let's just describe it for what it was. And so she would constantly get asked, are your policies going to change? Are you for turning? And her answer would be, the lady is not for turning. Now, Margaret Thatcher wasn't referring to someone else. She was referring to herself. It was a self-reference. Son of Man. Son of Man is an interesting title. It's actually Jesus' favorite way to refer to himself. Son of Man in the Gospels is only on Jesus' lips. Son of Man, in some passages, is connected to Daniel 9. In Daniel 9, and Son of Man, by the way, means just a human being. Son of a human being. That's actually what it means. It can idiomatically mean other things, but basically it's referring to a human being. Only in Daniel 7, which is the text that gets associated with the title, there's something interesting going on that's a cultural script. Because what is the Son of Man doing in Daniel 7? He's coming to the Ancient of Days. Here's the question. How does he Uber there? How does he get there? He rides the clouds. Here's the cultural script. In the Old Testament, besides this passage, only one figure rides the clouds. You know who it is? Only God rides the clouds. So you've got a human being doing God stuff. That's the point behind and underneath the title. That's a cultural script. If you understand the cultural script and you understand the background of the Daniel 7 passage, you will get what Jesus is implying or intimating. If you don't understand the cultural script, you'll miss it. It'll just go right by you. So, what's my point here? When some texts say, who do people say the Son of Man is? I actually think if you ask me, what did Jesus actually say when we were having this conversation? I would say, Jesus asked about the Son of Man. Jesus asked the Son of Man what the people thought. Jesus asked the Son of Man what the disciples thought. So why does one version say, who do people say that I am? Because embedded in that is Jesus' understanding of who the Son of Man is. And there's only one Son of Man, as far as Jesus is concerned in the way he's using the term, and that's himself. The lady is not fraterning. And so, am I getting the very words of Jesus? Or am I getting the voice of Jesus? Or to put it in another way, is it okay for the Gospels in one version to tell you what Jesus said, and in the other version to tell you what Jesus meant, which is embedded in what he said? You understand what I'm saying? It's important. Because sometimes what the Gospels writers are doing between the way they tell the versions that's generating the difference is they're making explicit what is being said that was implicitly embedded in what it is that Jesus said. And sometimes I may even be getting a summary of conversations, etc. Or let me talk about the Last Supper, a variation of this. You may or may not be aware that when it comes to the Last Supper, there are actually two versions of what Jesus said at the Last Supper. That Matthew and Mark align with one another and are similar. And Luke and 1 Corinthians, the report in Paul, line up with one another. And there's a very subtle difference between the two versions. So let me show you what that is. And if you have a Bible with you, and I'm assuming that you have it on a device, as opposed to carrying a Bible with pages, a thing called pages on it. Maybe there are a few old schoolers here. Is there someone? Yeah, look. Very good. He's got his Bible sitting right there in front of him. Very nice. Okay, so let's start off. Let's take a look at Mark. We're in Mark 14 and verse 22 and 23 and 24. So Mark 14:22. While they were eating, he took bread, and after giving thanks, he broke it, gave it to them, and said, "Take it, this is my body." And after taking the cup and giving thanks, he gave it to them, and they all drank from it. He said to them, "This is my blood." Watch this carefully. "The blood of the covenant that is poured out for many." Okay, that's Mark 14:24. So let's see what Luke has to say. Same event. We know this. What's important about this comparison is it's the same event. There's no idea that Jesus is doing this a couple of times. This is all happening at the same time in the same context. And now I'm in Luke 22, and I'm going to start in verse 19. Then he took bread, and after giving thanks, he broke it and gave it to them. "This is my body, which is given for you." Pretty close to what Mark and Matthew have. "Do this in remembrance of me." That's something that they don't have. In the same way, he took the cup after they had eaten, saying, I'm going to go slow, This cup that is poured out for you is the new covenant in my blood. What just happened? Mark has the blood of the covenant poured out for many. Luke has the new covenant in my blood poured out for you. What is going on? How do we explain the difference? Well, again, remember I said to you that what's embedded in the text, another writer might make explicit. Here's what I think is going on. I think that it's very, very likely that the Markan wording reflects what Jesus said. The blood of the covenant poured out for many. Luke comes along and he says, well, there's only one covenant left to be triggered out of the covenants of promise. We already know that Jesus is the son of Abraham. How do I know that? The Bible tells me so. In the genealogies. Okay? There it is in the genealogies. We also know that Jesus has been addressed as son of David, and that there's messianic expectation that rotates around him. Okay? Because we have stories in the Gospels that told us that. So the Abrahamic covenant and the Davidic covenant, they've been triggered by Jesus' mere presence. There's only one covenant of promise left. That's the new covenant. The covenant that represents the forgiveness of sins and the idea that I'm going to write the law in your heart. Or to use Ezekiel's language, I'm going to wash you clean and I'm going to put my spirit within you. Okay, which is the way Ezekiel talks about the new covenant. He doesn't name it the new covenant, but he's talking about the same thing that Jeremiah is. And so what Luke does is come along and say, the covenant that we're talking about, the covenant that Jesus meant, was the new covenant. It's also making the point, the new covenant is for lots of people. Okay? If it's for lots of people, it's certainly for the disciples. It's certainly for you. And so what you get is what is implicit in what is being said, and not so much brought to the surface. The other gospel writer is making explicit and making the move that way. And what we have, here's the fun part of this. What we have is not only what Jesus said, the system of verba, but we have the system of vox. We have the voice of Jesus because this is what Jesus meant. And so if I ask the question, what did Jesus say? I would say, well, Mark is probably giving us that. But what did Jesus mean, stated as precisely and clearly as you could say it? Luke is giving us that. Because when you bring the implicit and make it explicit, you're actually filling out and making clear what it is that is intended by the language. It isn't that you can't get there with the other language. You could and you can. But Luke is highlighting that implicit element of what was said in a slightly different way in another gospel. And again, you have difference, but you don't have contradiction. Here's a harder one. What I'm labeling updated sayings. So here it is. I'm at the beginning of the Olivet discourse in Mark 13. And Jesus has just predicted that there won't be one stone left upon another in the temple. The marvelous temple that's the center of Israel's worship. And so Mark 13:3 says this. So while he was sitting on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple, Peter, James, John, and Andrew asked him privately, tell us. 2 questions. When will these things happen? And what will be the sign that all these things are about to take place? So 2 questions. When will these things happen? And what will be the sign that they're going to take place? Matthew is basically parallel to Mark. Luke is basically parallel to Mark. Here's how Matthew opens the same scene. And remember, there's only one Olivet discourse. So again, we can't appeal to saying, oh, these are 2 separate events. So we're in Matthew 24, and in verse 2, Jesus announces that not one stone will be left on another, and then it goes on to say this in verse 3. As he was sitting on the Mount of Olives, His disciples came to him privately and said, now there's already a difference in that Mark named who the specific disciples were, and Matthew has left it generic, just his disciples came to him. Here are the questions. Tell us, when will these things happen? Okay, when will these things be? That's the same as what you had in Mark. And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? Something just happened. It isn't what will be the sign of these things are about to take place. A kind of event that we're talking about is highlighted. Now, think with me out loud. When it says, what will be the signs of your coming, what do you think is referred to here? What do you think that is? Christ's second coming. Yeah, it's not a hard question. All right, Christ's second coming. Here's the interesting fact that you have to think about. When the disciples say this, how much were they anticipating the fact that Jesus was going to die and be resurrected? 0. How do we know that? The women went to the tomb on the 3rd day. So now the question becomes, what is Matthew doing? What is Matthew doing suggesting in a question a reference to his second coming when the disciples probably didn't have a conception of second coming yet? It's an interesting question. It's a fair question. So what do you do with this? So here's what I think is going on. I think that what is going on is the disciples ask the question, what is going to be, what are the signs these things are going to take place? When are these things going to happen? And what are the signs these things are going to take place? What they really were asking was, what is the sign of your coming in the end of the age? That was entailed in that question. And that became clear to them later on that was what they were really asking. And Matthew makes that clear. It's another example of, upon further review, this is what was meant by the question. And Matthew's made the import of the question clear. It's like moments in class where I will explain something, and a student will respond to me by saying, Dr. Bock, did you mean? And then he says something to me, and I go, well, I wasn't actually thinking about that, but that is entailed in what I was saying to you. That kind of a move. Let the Scriptures breathe. Sometimes that's what's generating the differences that you see. Storytelling choices. Okay, here's an interesting one that I've heard brought up by skeptics, and it is the healing of the centurion's servant. There's no way that can be the same story in a real healing because they're not told the same way, which is actually true. They're not told the same way. In Matthew, the appearance is that Jesus and the centurion, when the centurion comes to ask for Jesus to heal his servant, are having a face-to-face conversation. Okay, and this is the passage with the famous line, just say the word, Lord, I'm a commander. When I say to the soldiers, move, they move, etc. Just speak the word and it will happen. And then Jesus says, I haven't found such faith in Israel. It's one of the few places where someone gets commended for what they say to Jesus. Pretty impressive. That's not how it works in Luke. In Luke, the centurion and Jesus never meet face to face. Everything that takes place through 2 sets of Jewish emissaries who are sent on behalf of the centurion to make the request on behalf of the centurion so he will act. And it's done in 2 movements. There's one set of emissaries who makes the initial appeal. There's a second set of emissaries that says, you don't have to come to my house, I understand, and then you get the line. So what's going on there? This is where cultural script comes in. Cultural script comes in. The cultural script is the principle of the shiliach, which is, when I send someone to speak on my behalf, it's as good as I'm speaking. The one who hears you hears me. when he's talking to the disciples about their teaching. So it's the shaliach principle. So it's as good as the centurion being there when the emissaries represent him. But the question is, why would Luke tell it that way and Matthew tell it the way that he tells it? The answer to that question is, Luke has a concern that Matthew doesn't have. The concern that Luke has that's dominating his two volumes is, how do Jews and Gentiles relate to one another? When we're at the synagogue scene in Luke 4, and the crowd is speculating when Jesus got up in Nazareth and said, I am the fulfillment of Isaiah 61 and Isaiah 58. They're saying, well, this is Joseph's son. They were contemplating that possibility. But the moment he went on to say, there was a time in Elijah's time and in Elisha's time in which God only worked among Gentiles. Ooh, and that made them mad. Okay? Because that was about reconciliation with people who were estranged. Gentiles were estranged from Jews. And the gospel was saying, we're going to bring people together who are estranged. Ooh, that's a controversial concept. And Luke was concerned about that because when we get to Acts, he's explaining how the gospel went out to all the nations. And how they're going to be Jews and Gentiles together among the people of God. And he's concerned about that. Matthew isn't. So you get the difference. And in fact, you probably get more precision at what happened at this event from Luke as a result than you have in Matthew, but you've got gist and variation. The gist of the story is the same. Jesus performed a healing for a centurion slave. But the details were different. Not contradictory, okay, but simply told differently. Another example of the same thing is the raising of Jairus' daughter. In the raising of Jairus' daughter, you get 14 verses, I think, in Mark, and something close to that in Luke, and you get a whole drama. Synagogue leader approaches Jesus, says, my daughter is dying, can you come and heal her? He goes along the way and they're interrupted. They're interrupted by a woman with a hemorrhage. Jesus decides not only to heal her, but to interview her as a result of the healing. Imagine being Jairus in the midst of this situation. Okay? It's like being late in a traffic jam. Not good. Okay? So there you are, you're stuck in the middle, you're waiting for this interview to take place, and all of a sudden a servant shows up from Jairus' house saying, don't bother the teacher anymore, she's dead. Okay? Story's over as far as they're concerned. Okay? Jesus goes on and says, oh, she's just sleeping, which really confuses them because they know it's not a nap. And he goes and raises her from the dead. All right? In Matthew, which is only 8 verses long, he's compacted the story. It begins by saying, and Jairus' daughter was dead. Not because he's trying to give out the sequence of how it happened, but the only thing that matters to Matthew is that by the time Jesus got to Jairus' daughter, she was quite dead. There were mourners outside who were mourning her death. And it's just a more compact way to tell the story. And that's a difference, but it's not a contradiction. It just has to do with a literary choice about how to tell the story. It's another example of letting the Scriptures breathe. Okay, here's another one. Supplementing information between two accounts of the same event. Bart Ehrman likes this one. He says, the Gospels don't agree on the mood of Jesus when he's being crucified. In Mark, we get the use of Psalm 22:1, which basically just says that Jesus is despairing as he goes to the cross because he says, my God, why have you forsaken me? Okay? And he's in despair. He's in despair because he's bearing the sin at that point. Possibly, that's what's going on. But he's in despair. In Luke, we also only get one passage. The passage that we get is Psalm 31:5. Into your hands I commit my spirit. There's no despair there. There's only trust. He's totally comfortable with what's going on. Two Ehrman claims, contradictory ways of presenting the crucifixion, which I think I could suggest the crucifixion is a pretty important part of the Gospels. So what do you do with that? Well, here a tool helps us. The tool is called a synopsis. Synopsis, and you might sometimes know it as a harmony in your own language. It takes the versions and it puts them side by side, so you can look at them side by side and actually do an examination of the nature of the differences. Careful examination. What's interesting is, in the Greek, this is very, very clear, as you move through the comparison of Mark to Luke, Mark has at one point, later on, after Psalm 22:1, this remark, and Jesus cried out a second time. But he doesn't tell you what he said. But at the very point in Luke's story where we get to that very point, we get the citation of Psalm 31:5. So Luke is telling you what Jesus said at the second cry out on the cross that Mark didn't bother to tell us. Maybe didn't know it. Who knows? Okay? That's a case of supplementing information. Now, people who are skeptical say, oh, you're harmonizing the Bible. No, I'm not. I'm taking two sets of witnesses, okay? And witnesses, when they tell an event, they'll have some overlap and they'll also have some differences. And in this particular case, the way the story lays out, it's just interesting. My kids used to call what I call a coincidence a coinky-dink when they were growing up. Okay? It happens to be a coinky-dink that right at the point of the second cry of Mark is what you get in Luke. Supplementing information. Last point, and then we can chat about everything that I've said. On Christology, I've tried to say to you and suggest to you that because of cultural scripts, sometimes Jesus' actions mean as much for understanding who Jesus is as trying to search for the titles and how he describes himself through titles. Let me give you an example of this. When John the Baptist is in prison, and remember John the Baptist said the Messiah is coming, the axe is laid at the root of the tree, he's expecting judgment, he's expecting victory, and the judgment and the victory that he expects has now put him firmly in jail. And he's probably meditating on, where is this powerful Messiah that I thought was coming? So he sends messengers to Jesus. And the messengers are to ask, here's a cultural script, are you the coming one or should we expect another? Okay, now here, the title is the cultural script. The coming one obviously is a reference to the hope of the Messiah. Are you the Messiah or not? That's what he's asking. And John the Baptist didn't watch enough television. So he didn't know how to ask this question. Because if he watched television, he would have asked it this way. Are you the coming one, yes or no? Okay? He would have tried to close the loop on the way he asked the question. But he didn't do that. He just said, are you the coming one or should we expect another? It was an open-ended question. So Jesus took advantage of the open door and went through it. How does Jesus answer the question? He doesn't answer it yes or no. He goes about describing what he's doing. His actions speak and reveal his intention. And so you have things like the blind see, the deaf hear, good news is preached to the poor, the dead are raised. If you actually run down those phrases, they actually, except for one of them, all come from passages in Isaiah where Isaiah is describing what God will do at the end. Are you the coming one or should we expect another? You're going to understand who I am by what I do. That's Jesus' answer. And if you understand what I am doing, cultural script. If you will understand what I am doing, you will understand who I am. And you'll also know what time it is. If you know what time it is, then you will know who I am. That's what Jesus is saying in that example. I wish I had time, I don't, to work through the healing of the paralytic. It's a great text. You know, the guy drops in, front of Jesus, seeks to be healed, and Jesus gives him the comforting words as he's sitting there on his mat, hoping to be able to get up and walk away. Your sins are forgiven. Okay, this is not in the text, okay, but think about it. You're either that guy or the friends who lowered him down, and when Jesus says to the guy, your sins are forgiven, what do you think he's thinking? That's not why I crashed this party. That's not why I'm here. And then Jesus goes through this thing about what's easier to say, your sins are forgiven, or get up and walk. It's a trick question. It's actually, in one sense, easier to say your sins are forgiven. Because how are you going to see it? Do you know what sins being forgiven looks like? Bye, sin. Nice to see you leaving. Hope you never come back. Okay, you can't see forgiveness of sins. But if I say to a guy who can't walk, who's on a mat, get up and walk, it's showtime. Something's got to happen. But the actual harder thing is to have the authority to forgive sins. In fact, the theologians in the audience know this because they say, only God can forgive sins. That's the cultural script of the scene revealed for you through what the theologians are saying. Two interesting things about this scene. I love this passage. First, sometimes the theologians are all over what's going on. They get what's going on. They don't believe it, but they understand what's being claimed. And the second thing is, when you're thinking privately in front of Jesus in the Gospels, it's usually bad for the person doing the thinking. Okay? There's a retort or a response coming that's going to try and correct or at least illuminate what's being thought. And that's exactly what happens here. In order that you might know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins, I say to you, get up and walk. So he takes something that you can't see. You can't see forgiveness of sins. Links it to something that you can see, the healing of someone who can't walk so that they can walk. And when he gets up and walk, his walk talks. And what the walk says is, the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins. The Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins. This one who rides the clouds, cultural script, has the authority to forgive sins. But only one person forgives sins. That's God. You're watching it dawn on someone, and you're watching the Synoptics Gospels reveal, by the way they tell the story, how it can dawn on someone who Jesus is. Okay, that goes through the list. The point that I'm making is, let the Gospels breathe. They have a variety of ways that they do things. Let each Gospel speak, but don't over-literalize or limit the way the Gospels can work in the differences that they have with one another. No single Gospel tells us everything, and together we get a depth of portrait. I'm going to close with this illustration. We get 4 Gospels, and God didn't send us just one version of the Gospels because the Gospels give us depth. It's like quadraphonic sound. 4 speakers, each doing their own thing. And when you mix it all together, the sound is deeper and richer than if you had 4 speakers doing exactly the same thing. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is at least a part of how the Gospels work.